Greetings. This is a lecture on social hedonism or utilitarianism. In our class, for the purposes of our class, I'm not going to make a big distinction between utilitarianism and social hedonism. Strictly speaking, they are distinct, and I do talk about that a little bit in the lecture notes, and I will in this presentation, but we're going to collapse that distinction for the purposes of this class, and you'll see why in a moment. So let me begin. There we are. Okay, so social hedonism. Now remember, I'm taking this is a jumping off point from egoistic hedonism. Presumably we've just gone through the lecture on Epicurus and egoistic hedonism. Hedonism, the view that pleasure and pleasure alone is of intrinsic value. Egoism, the view that the right thing for the agent to do is whatever is in the agent's best interest. Now, if best interest is defined as pleasure, then egoistic hedonism says the right thing for the agent to do is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain for the agent, and others need not concern the agent, right? That was considered to be deficient as an account of morality. That suggested that merely being prudent and doing what's good for you would be the same thing as being moral and doing what's morally required. That goes against a strong intuition we have that sometimes, at least occasionally, morality requires doing something which is not in our best interest. In other words, sacrificing our own best interest for the welfare of others. So this is captured to some extent by an alternative to egoistic hedonism, and that alternative is social hedonism or utilitarianism. And, oh, there we are. So social hedonism, we're looking at two different versions of this, act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. That'll be clear as we move on. So egoistic hedonism was considered unsatisfactory as a moral theory because it explicitly rejects what many call the moral point of view. The moral point of view is the idea that moral action requires that we treat others and oneself equally. Right? That one treats others and oneself equally. Being moral, it suggested, is not merely being prudent, as egoism implies, but rather a willingness to, sometimes at least, sacrifice one's own best interest for the welfare of another. As a correction to egoistic hedonism of Epicurus, other philosophers, specifically Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, but others, proposed social hedonism or utilitarianism, the central tenet of which is what's called the principle of utility. The principle of utility is the following principle. An action is right if and only if it results in the greatest good for the greatest number. Right? An action is right if and only if it results in the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, number of what? Well, certainly we can at least mean of people, but notice it's not in principle limited to people. You might talk about the greatest good for the greatest number of sentient creatures, right? So built into this principle of utility is at least the potential for granting to sentient animals, right, moral standing, etc. Now, there is a minor difference between social hedonism and utilitarianism. Specifically, utilitarianism is the view that an action is right if and only if it results in the greatest good for the greatest number, as previously stated. But here, good is not specified and may include other things besides pleasure. The 20th century philosopher G.E. Moore was this kind of utilitarian. And he said, look, I mean pleasure, but I mean other things beyond pleasure, not just pleasure. So G.E. Moore was not a hedonist, though he was a utilitarian. But if you are a hedonistic utilitarian, and you mean by good pleasure, that pleasure and pleasure alone is the only thing of intrinsic value, well, then you have social hedonism. An action is right if and only if it results in the greatest pleasure for the greatest number. Right? So good now is much more specified. Here, good is specified as pleasure, and Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill were this sort of utilitarian. They were indeed hedonists. Now, the only two utilitarians we're going to look at in this course are John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. Those are the only ones we're going to look at. So we, in fact, will only be looking at social hedonism versions of utilitarianism. It's not going to make a difference for us. Oh, pardon me, one moment. How do I pause? Oh, I think I can't pause here. I think I have to pause here. Turns out it was spam. Surprise, surprise. Okay, let me go back to sharing my screen. So this is why I'm not going to make a very big difference between the two, and I'm going to collapse social hedonism and utilitarianism as if they were exactly the same thing. Now, if you were to go on to another course, that you might want to be aware of the fact that there is a slight difference between them. So were you to take another course, perhaps an upper division course in ethics, let's say, that might be an important distinction. But for our purposes, the only utilitarians we're going to be looking at were social hedonists. So I will treat the terms utilitarianism and social hedonism as synonymous. According to this view, morality requires that one value everyone's welfare, not just one's own. So this is why it's social hedonism, not egoistic hedonism. Utilitarianism implies that it may be morally necessary to sacrifice one's own self-interest for the good of others, at least in certain circumstances. Social hedonism or utilitarianism suggests a costs-benefits analysis where pleasure and pain is the coin of the realm. So as with egoistic hedonism, any version of hedonism actually simplifies morality greatly, because the only factors you need to consider are the consequences of the behavior, and in particular, the pleasure-pain consequences of the behavior. Add up the pleasures, minus the pains, you get the net value, and then you compare that against alternative courses of action. That's the costs benefits analysis, right? Now, for the egoist, you only do that for yourself. For the utilitarian, you have to imagine and try to do that for everyone who's affected by the action. So not just the pleasures and pains that the action might have for you as an agent, but also of everybody affected by your action. According to this view, the right course of action among available alternatives is whichever one nets the greatest amount of pleasure. And I'm assuming most of you, if not all of you, are working individuals, and so you know the difference between your gross pay and your net pay, right? So it's not the gross amount of pleasure the action creates, it's the net amount. You have to subtract the costs. So if my business plan is grossing $1 million, ooh, but it's costing me 2 million, I'm not making a profit, okay? So note, if pleasure and pleasure alone is of intrinsic value, then the only thing that can make an action right is that it's pleasure enhancing, and the only thing that can make an action wrong is that it's pleasure reducing. Thus, all actions can only be morally evaluated relative to the pleasure and pain they produce. Again, this is a very simplified view of trying to make ethical decisions. Utilitarianism is, in one way, the most idealistic of all ethical theories. It sort of takes for granted that people will be motivated to work for the general good. So the most famous advocates of utilitarianism are Jeremy Bentham, again writing in the, spanning both the 18th and 19th century, and then John Stuart Mill in the 19th century. We're going to look at Bentham first. Jeremy Bentham's version of utilitarianism is more narrowly referred to as act utilitarianism, and that's how we're going to refer to it here. And a statement of his view would be this: an action is right if and only if it results in the greatest pleasure for the greatest number. And he did most often have in mind number of sentient creatures. So from Bentham's point of view, if a creature, a human or a non-human animal, can experience pain or pleasure, they have to be factored into the calculus. Their pain and pleasure matters. Why? Because pain and pleasure are the only intrinsically valuable or disvaluable things, and therefore we have to consider the total amount of pleasure and the total amount of pain, and that includes the pain and pleasure of non-human animals as well. So imagine I've been invited over my neighbors for dinner this weekend, and I'm trying to decide if I ought to go or not. I consider that if I go, she's not a very good cook, and her kids get on my nerves. On the other hand, there is a season of Star Trek Voyager, which I've been wanting to binge watch. I could binge watch that and stay home. I reason. So if I have to consider the people affected by my actions and the actions open to me. I could go to dinner or I could not go to dinner. And who are the people affected by my actions? Me. Well, if I go to dinner, that's a -2. Bad cook, annoying kids. Staying home, not going, binge watching my Star Trek Voyager season, +2. Well, guess what I'm going to do? Now, if I were an egoistic hedonist, like Epicurus, I'd be done. I would only have to consider how much pleasure an action would bring to me and weigh it against alternative actions. But the utilitarian would say, wait. You can't just consider yourself. You need to consider others affected by your action. I must therefore consider my neighbor. All right, so that complicates my calculation then, right? There's me going -2, staying home +2. Then my neighbor would enjoy my company. I could help clean up, I guess, afterwards, +1. Staying home, mildly annoyed, but not heartbroken. So it's -1. Now, what is the net value? Well, the net value of my going to dinner and eating my neighbor's lousy food, -1. The net value of me staying home and binge watching Star Trek, +1. If we were the only two people affected by this action, what should I do? Well, from a utilitarian standpoint, I should stay home. Why? I'm creating more happiness, more pleasure by staying home than going. Even if I sacrifice myself, I'm still going to end up creating a -1 unit of happiness. By not sacrificing my best interest, I create a +1. So I'm still ahead. Okay, but look, I still create more net pleasure by staying home and binge watching. Yay! Therefore, this is the moral thing for me to do. It's the right thing for me to do. Why? This action results in the greatest net pleasure. But there's my wife to consider. She enjoys my neighbor's company, if not her cooking, and the thought of me lying around watching a silly science fiction TV series for hours would annoy her. So I have to take her into account. Right? All right. Well, my wife would enjoy the company. That makes it a +1. My sitting watching me, my mind melt while I'm watching this nonsense TV show would drive my wife a little bit nuts. Not horrible, but a little bit, -1. So what's the net value of me going to dinner? 0. What's the net value of me staying home? 0. Which of these two actions has the greater amount of net pleasure? Well, hopefully you see neither. Neither has a greater value. So which of these two courses of action is superior to the other? Neither. They're absolutely equivalent because they have the same bottom line, the same net value. So which one ought I do? Well, from a utilitarian standpoint, either one. I could go or I could not go. And in neither case am I doing something preferable to the other. Guess what I'm going to do? Okay, but look now. I create no more net pleasure by staying home than by going. Both actions are of equivalent value and thus morally equal. It does not matter which I choose. Therefore, it is moral for me to do either, since I'm not creating more pleasure by going than I would be by staying home. Again, so can you guess which one I'm going to do? But there's those annoying children. For whatever reason, they enjoy having me over, which is one of the reasons I kind of find them annoying. So the final tally looks like this. Me, if I go, -2. If I stay home, +2. My neighbor, if I go, +1. If I stay home, -1. My wife, if I go, +2. If I stay home, -1. Oh, +1, -1. Neighbor's children, if I go, +2. If I stay home, 0, they probably wouldn't even notice, right? What's the right thing for me to do? Which of these two courses of action has the greatest net pleasure? Me going. So on this calculation, I am morally required to do that. And why is that? Because I create more happiness, more pleasure, more of the thing of intrinsic value in the world by going than I would by staying home. Thus, going creates more pleasure than does not going. I am morally compelled by the principle of utility to go and eat my neighbor's lousy food and put up with her annoying children. While morality does not always require that I sacrifice my own happiness for the sake of others, there are circumstances where it does, according to utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, oh, I said this already, but I'll say it again, is in one way the most idealistic of all theories. It takes for granted that people will be motivated to work for the general good. This was the ethical theory which inspired the reform movements of the newly industrialized countries of Europe during the 19th century. Utilitarian thinking helped bring about and justify the welfare state. Karl Marx's political theory was a reaction to the same kinds of social inequities that he thought needed to be addressed, and alleviation of suffering, etc. This is also the principle behind decriminalizing so-called victimless crimes. The idea here is that if I'm not hurting anybody, then why would you make me suffer and inflict pain on me if I'm not inflicting pain on anybody else? You're introducing needless pain and suffering into the world. In law and legal reasoning, this is known as the principle of harm. And so it makes sense to make something illegal if it's in fact harmful, but not if it's not harming anyone. Again, a victimless crime. Since so much depends on correctly estimating the magnitude of resulting pleasure, Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, gives some pointers as to what to consider. So he offers 7 aspects to a pleasure one should consider when trying to estimate its actual value. Number 1, intensity. How intense is the pleasure? This is the aspect of a pleasure one is considering, according to Bentham, when one estimates how acute, extreme, or potent the pleasure is. The more intense the pleasure, the greater its value, all other things being equal. So an intense pleasure is more valuable than a mild pleasure. And notice the reverse for pain. A mild pain is not nearly as negative a value as an intense pain. Number 2, duration. Duration is that aspect of a pleasure one is considering, according to Bentham, when one estimates how long the pleasure lasts. The longer it lasts, the greater its value, all other things being equal. So a long enduring pleasure is more pleasure, is higher value than a short-lived pleasure. Now, sometimes these things play against each other, right? So which is better, a very intense pleasure that only lasts a short time, or a mild pleasure that lasts a long time? Okay, well, you'd have to think about that a bit, right? Now, if I were to ask which is better, an intense pleasure that lasts a short time or an intense pleasure that lasts a long time, well, that's not the same problem then, right? So again, that's what I mean by the phrase, all other things being equal. If the duration is the same, then intensity is to be preferred. Number 3, purity. That aspect of a pleasure one is considering, according to Bentham, when one estimates whether or not the pleasure is mixed with any aggravation. The purer the pleasure, the greater its value, all other things being equal. So my go-to example for this is seedless and seeded grapes. So imagine you have white grapes on sale at Winn-Dixie. They cost the same, they taste the same. One is seedless and one is seeded. Which one are you more likely to buy? I'm going to guess you would buy the seedless grapes. Why? Well, because even the seeded grapes are delicious and tasty and might be worth, eating and buying. But if I could get that same delicious taste and experience without those damn annoying seeds, I would prefer that. Why? It's a pure pleasure. So again, all other things being equal, the purer the pleasure, the greater it is. If it's not mixed with some sort of aggravation or annoyance. Surety. How sure is the pleasure? It's that aspect of a pleasure one is considering, according to Bentham, when one estimates the risk involved in the pleasure. The more certain one is of the pleasure, the greater its value, all other things being equal. This, for instance, is why I keep eating at the same restaurants over and over again, because I know I will get a good meal. They're a sure thing, right? There are certain restaurants which, I don't know, I might be tempted to go to, but it's not as sure, right? And what if I spend a whole lot of money on a lousy meal? Maybe that's why I think I go to that same Thai restaurant that I like so much, okay? So this is surety. Similar to surety is the fifth, which is propinquity. That's not a word we use that much anymore, propinquity or propinquitousness or something like that, but it just means nearness, to be proximate. So it's that aspect of a pleasure one is considering, according to Bentham, when one considers how close at hand the pleasure is. The more near at hand the pleasure, the greater its value, all other things being equal. So I think what motivates this for Bentham is, again, a near at hand pleasure is a surer pleasure than a, say, far distant pleasure. You've heard the saying, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Well, clearly a bird in the hand is worth more than a bird in the bush, right? One bird in the hand is worth more than one bird in the bush. In other words, a sure thing or propinquitous pleasure is more valuable than a distant or unsure pleasure, right? That's what his thinking is there. And number 6, this is a word that may not be familiar to you as well, fecundity. But this is a word that does have much more contemporary usage, but often it's used in sort of legal contexts, etc. Fecundity is that aspect of a pleasure one is considering, according to Bentham, when one estimates whether or not the pleasure is likely to give rise to other future pleasures. It's the more fecund the pleasure, the greater its value, all other things being equal. So fecund and fecundity has its roots in sort of pregnancy, to have value impregnated in it, right? Nested inside. So there are certain pleasures. Well, you know where it's used, as I said, sometimes in legal context. So let's say I have a successful restaurant and I'm going to sell to you my successful restaurant. Well, I would expect you not only to compensate me for the pots and the pans and the dishes and the linens and this sort of thing, but I'm also selling you a successful business, a fecund enterprise, and a business with profit nested inside. And so I would expect to be compensated because this is fecund. It has, again, a likely profit, if you don't mess things up, nested inside. It's up, it's running, it has a good reputation, it has a good clientele, etc. So that would be what's meant by a fecund enterprise or a fecund business. A fecund pleasure would be a pleasure that has the likelihood of future pleasures nested inside. My favorite example of that would be, say, going on vacation. Well, not only do you enjoy your vacation and you enjoyed, laying out on the beach and getting some sun or I don't know, skiing or whatever it is, or visiting a foreign country, but for years after that, you're able to derive future pleasures by remembering, by talking with the people you were on vacation with. Oh, remember when we went to that cafe? Or, oh, remember that one waiter? Or, oh, remember that, hike up the mountainside or whatnot. And you can enjoy that pleasure over and over again. So that would be an example of a fecund pleasure. By contrast, very often, it's said that drug addiction is an anti-fecund pleasure because it impedes your ability to experience future pleasures. I've been told by people familiar, I'm not, but I've been told by people familiar that your best heroin high is the first one, and it kind of goes downhill after that, right? So I don't know that that's true, but if it's true, then it would clearly be an anti-fecund pleasure, because rather than having future pleasures nested inside, it actually diminishes your ability to experience pleasures going forward. And then number 7, scope, the minty fresh mouthwash. No, scope means in addition to all of these 1 through 6, I have to consider how these factor into the experiences of others. So notice, I think Epicurus and Bentham would have agreed on number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6, right? I think Epicurus and Bentham would have said, consider intensity, duration, purity, surety, propinquity, fecundity. But where they part companies on number 7, Bentham says, I have to consider the intensity, duration, purity, surety, propinquity, fecundity for me and for the other people affected by my actions, the scope of my actions. And again, as an egoist, Epicurus wouldn't have made that claim. So those are the 7 aspects to a pleasure. But note something further. Each of these seems to be concerned exclusively with the amount of pleasure the act produces. So this is a term we'll look at later, but I'll mention it now. Bentham is what's called a quantitative hedonist. And he wants to say what matters about pleasure is the amount, the quantity. And for 2 pleasures to be of unequal value, that only happens if they are of unequal quantity. If they are of equal quantity, they are of equal value. And then if one is more than the other, then that's of superior value. One is less, then it's of inferior value. And the only question to ask is a question of quantity, how much? So again, all 7 seem to be reinforcing this idea that he's a quantitative hedonist. The idea of act utilitarianism does seem to capture how we do try to reason, at least sometimes. So I think there are certain confirming moral intuitions that advance utilitarian thinking and reasoning. And so let's look at what of our ordinary moral reasoning might suggest utilitarianism is correct. Imagine, for instance, that a physician gives a heart to a transplant patient, Annie, instead of an alternative transplant patient, Bill, and tells us he did so because Annie is a 30-year-old single mother of 3 and their sole means of support, whereas Bill is a 55-year-old bachelor. He reasons that more good, happiness, pleasure is likely to come from giving the heart to the younger patient with dependent children. Even if we ultimately disagree with him, we can see his point. He seems to be citing more relevant moral reasons. So notice, we're going on the presumption that each candidate for the heart is equally likely successful, right? Often this only happens in philosophical thought experiments, but so each one is equally likely to be a successful recipient of the transplant heart. So if they're likely to be successful in either case, then what other considerations might I take into account? Well, I might take into account how much good, how much pleasure, how much happiness would result from giving it to one over the other. And here the physician is reasoning giving it to Annie is superior to giving it to Bill because she's a single mother with dependent children. He's an older bachelor with no children. By contrast, if he said, oh, well, of course I gave it to Annie because I always go alphabetically, that would strike us as weird and irrelevant. So notice, we don't think that whether your name comes first alphabetically is morally relevant. So notice there's something important here, right? Being alphabetical is not a morally relevant consideration, and yet how much pleasure or happiness results from the action does seem to be morally relevant in exactly the way that being alphabetical does not, right? So I'm just pointing out that utilitarianism does seem to capture something that we take to be morally significant when making these kinds of decisions. It does seem to play some role in our moral thinking. But the question becomes, does it play every role? Is it the sole determinant of whether an action is right or wrong? So I think that there are problems with act utilitarianism, and that's what I want to discuss next, right? So first, I'm going to be rather artificial. We're going to talk about 4 problems, 2 of which I term as practical problems, 2 of which I term as theoretical problems. This is sort of an artificial division, but it makes it easier to sort of organize. So that's why I'm doing it this way. So first, practical problems. Note, a practical problem is an objection to a theory which claims that whether or not the theory is true, the theory is problematic because it cannot be used. It cannot be put into practice. So that's what the practical problem is claiming, right? That this theory cannot actually guide our actions. We cannot use it to determine what we ought to do. Why? Well, first of all, estimating these values. I mean, maybe when I was giving you my first table of calculations, and I said, oh, going over my neighbor's house is a -2, but staying home and watching Star Trek is a +2. And if I stay home, my neighbor has a -1, but if I go, my neighbor has a +1. You might go, where are these numbers coming from? Well, that is a problem, isn't it? It's a practical problem. How are we to assign numerical value to what we might call human intangibles, right? Things like family or health or reputation. I mean, let alone watching Star Trek, but what does my family mean to me? And what would the loss of my family constitute? And what number would I put on that? Now, that's a rhetorical question. How would I put a number on such a thing? The non-rhetorical way of making that same statement is to say we cannot put numerical value on such things, again, on these human intangibles. But notice, if we literally can't put a number, then we can't do the kind of mathematical calculations that Bentham is requiring of us, that act utilitarianism is requiring us. He was quite literal in terms of calculating. He actually wrote a rather extended treatise on the hedonic calculus and how to calculate these sorts of things or whatnot. And really did think you add up the pleasures, you subtract the pains, and you get the net value. But if I can't put numerical value on certain things, then I can't do precisely what act utilitarianism is asking me to do. In a similar way, we can't always know what the consequences of our actions are. I mean, did Grandma Hitler know what she was getting herself into when she decided to have kids? No, presumably not, right? And if I can't know what the consequences of my actions are, then I can't estimate the value, the pleasure and pain consequences, right? So I don't know necessarily what's going to happen next year or a generation from now or 100 years down the road, etc. But if that's the case, then I can't properly appraise my action. And that means I can't do the calculations that act utilitarianism is requiring. So notice these two objections are not saying that it's false to say that an action is right if and only if the action results in the greatest pleasure for the greatest number. It's not saying that that claim is false. It's saying that even if that claim is true, we can't use this theory to determine what it is we ought to do because we can't estimate the values and we can't predict the consequences. Now, the other two problems I want to point out are theoretical problems. And by a theoretical problem, this is an objection to a theory which claims that whether or not the theory can be used, the theory is problematic because it simply isn't true. It isn't complete, it isn't accurate. So the theoretical problems are not saying, oh, I can't utilize this theory to determine what I'm trying to do. It's simply saying that the theory is not an adequate account of ethics or ethical reasoning. Now, why might one object to utilitarianism? On theoretical grounds. Well, it seems counterintuitive to our thinking about morally prohibited behavior. What do I have in mind here? Well, if I were to ask you, is cheating or stealing wrong? Right? Let's just take one at a time. Is cheating wrong? Or is stealing wrong? Or even is murder wrong? If you ask a act utilitarianism, any of those questions, what is the utilitarian going to tell you? Is murder, lying, cheating, stealing wrong? Depends. Depends on what? Depends on the consequences. What is the net value of the act of murder or the act of theft or the act of lying or the act of cheating? What are the consequences? If the consequences on balance are superior to the consequences of not murdering or not cheating or not lying, then yeah, it's perfectly okay to do those things. On the other hand, if they result in more pain than the alternative, then it's wrong. Remember, they're saying that the only thing that makes an action right or wrong are the consequences. The kind of action that it is morally irrelevant. Right? So they're always going to say it depends. Now, is slavery wrong? Well, they say if slavery benefits more people than it harms, then it's moral. But that strikes us as counterintuitive, which is a fancy way of saying weird, right? It does seem to go against strongly held beliefs that there are certain kinds of actions which are immoral and we ought to avoid. Now, this is not merely the position that the ends justify the means. That view, the ends justify the means, does acknowledge that means matter. In fact, means matter so much that they, in some cases, need to be justified. So if you say, well, you really ought not to lie, but in some cases it might be justified, right? Well, that's still saying that there is an initial objection to the very act of lying. Utilitarianism doesn't act. Utilitarianism is not saying that. There's nothing inherently wrong with lying or cheating or stealing or murdering or the rest, right? Nothing inherently wrong with any of those. The only thing that's inherently wrong is securing less than the greatest pleasure for the greatest number. So the morality of cheating, stealing, murdering all depend on the consequences of any particular situation according to this moral theory. So my larger point here is that runs against strong moral intuitions that we have, which suggest that one, at least prima facie, ought not to lie, ought not to cheat, ought not to steal, ought not to murder. Note further that if two courses of action result in the same amount of pleasure, but one requires theft, lying, and murder, while the other did not, neither course of action would be morally preferable according to utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is only interested in the bottom line, not how you got there. So if we're doing our costs benefits analysis, we just look at the bottom line, the net value. How you arrive at that net value is irrelevant from the point of view of act utilitarianism. So imagine two courses of action, one which requires lies, cheating, and murder, the second which requires no lies, no cheating, no murder, and both result in 10 units of happiness. They would say both courses of action are morally equivalent. Well, again, this strikes us as counterintuitive, weird. It seems to run against strong intuitions we have. And therefore, it seems to indicate that this theory is flawed. Notice further, if action A requires lying, cheating, murdering, and ends up with 10 units of happiness, and action B requires no lies, no cheating, no murder, but only ends up with 9 units of happiness, action A is to be preferred, even though its superiority in terms of pleasure production is marginal. Again, strikes us as weird. Second theoretical problem, this view seems diametrically opposed to our notion of moral rights. Rights seem to be best understood as checks on utilitarian advances. So for instance, it's true to say that I have 2 TVs at my house. It's true, I do have 2. Right? You might think to yourself, well, he doesn't need both, right? How many TVs do you really actually need? And we could do more good if we took his TV, one of them, and we donated it to, I don't know, an adult daycare center, so they have something to watch during the day or something like that. And so there you are, coming up on my front porch to take my my superfluous TV, or one you believe to be superfluous, right? On the idea that you're going to secure better consequences by this action. And I whip out my right to private property, right? And this is like a crucifix, right? And I say, get back, because I have a right to private property. What is that understood as? No matter what positive consequences you might secure by taking my stuff without my permission, you're not allowed to. You are morally prohibited to by this right. So that's what I mean as a right being a check on utilitarian advances. It seems to suggest that you don't merely consider what good consequences would result, but whether or not rights are involved. But on an act utilitarian view of morality, there exists no such things as rights. There are no rights. Notice that my right to property is another way of claiming that no matter what noble ends you might have in mind, helping the poor, feeding the hungry, educating children, you are morally prohibited from taking my stuff without my permission. Likewise with rights to life or liberty. So my right to life is another way of saying no matter how happy people might be, if I were dead, you're not allowed to kill me. Or no matter how happy people might be, if you restrain me and restrict my liberty, you're not allowed to do so. Right? So rights seem to be diametrically opposed to this sort of consequentialist act utilitarian thinking. If you think there exist such things as rights, then you would have to think there's something deeply wrong with act utilitarianism. Right, the theoretical objection above is meant to show that utilitarianism is counterintuitive. Still, pointing out that a theory has weird results, that is counterintuitive results, isn't the same thing as proving the theory is false. Furthermore, it can be said on the utilitarian's behalf that it is the job of moral theories to correct mistaken intuitions. So it seems to me the act utilitarian might say, well, I know you might have these intuitions that certain kinds of actions are wrong, like cheating, or that there are such things as individual rights, but those are mistaken intuitions. The truth of my theory wins out. And the whole point of a moral theory is to correct mistaken intuitions, isn't it? So the utilitarian could dig in her heels and say, I've given you an argument for my theory. Pleasure and pleasure alone is of intrinsic value. Everybody's pleasure needs to be taken into account. Therefore, an action is right if and only if it results in the greatest pleasure for the greatest number. So how might the act utilitarian respond to some of the problems we've suggested, both the practical problems and the theoretical problems? To the practical problems, remember practical problem number one, oh my goodness, we could never put numerical values on such human intangibles as your family or your reputation or your career. Well, this seems to be a weak objection when you poke at it a little bit. Why? Because we already do this, right? Particularly in our civil court proceedings. So if you've injured me and you've deprived me of my health, I can sue you for compensation, right? In other words, I can ask the jury to put a number on what I am owed in compensation for what I've been deprived in terms of my health or my reputation, if you've slandered me or libeled me, etc. So to say, oh, I could never put a number on such human intangibles, well, we sometimes do, right? Now, it's not easy. And it's a challenge, and it's not exacting work, right? There's a kind of ambiguity or vagueness to coming up with these numbers, but it's not like the jury throws a dart at a board. Well, oh, look, you got the prize, right? No, presumably they take all sorts of things into account. What is the age of the person? What is the occupation of the person? How active were they before the accident occurred? All these things get factored into estimating the value, the numeric value, appropriately. So it's a rational affair. And to the idea, oh, well, you can't know what the consequences of your actions are. Who knows, what ultimately would happen, right? Well, again, I don't know how clear of an objection that is either. Right? I mean, well, yes, I held the pistol to his head and I pulled the trigger, but how was I supposed to know that, he'd die as a result? Well, no, in certain cases, it's pretty darn clear what the consequences of an action would be or are likely to be. And so what if we said this? We said, well, we should hold people responsible for the consequences they could reasonably foresee. So maybe not Grandma Hitler for having kids and ending up, having a grandson who went on to embroil Western Europe in a world war, right? But we will hold you responsible for pulling the trigger on a pistol that was held at somebody's head. Right? So the consequences for which you can reasonably be foreseen. To theoretical problem number one, well, maybe cheating is, how do we justify the claim cheating is wrong or moral or lying is wrong? On act utilitarian grounds, perhaps we can't. Well, again, the act utilitarian might dig in her heels and simply say, calling my theory weird is not a critical response. So just saying it gave you results you didn't anticipate or that conflict with previously held intuitions doesn't demonstrate in and of itself, but my theory is flawed. So that's the way the act utilitarian can respond to both theoretical objection number 1 and theoretical objection number 2. Another way is the utilitarian can reform the theory and say, all right, you're right. We need to make some changes. We need to make some reforms to this theory. This is what John Stuart Mill does. So John Stuart Mill is going to give a different version of utilitarianism. And in part, what motivates his version is his response to some of these practical and theoretical problems that we've already discussed. So John Stuart Mill attempts to refine utilitarianism in a way that deals with the aforementioned problems. He accepts the idea that calculating every decision according to such criteria is a practical impossibility on a day-to-day basis. What ethics needs to provide then are general action-guiding rules. At least this is what Mill thought. He uses the logic of utilitarianism to provide us with good action-guiding moral rules. It perhaps is worth mentioning that John Stuart Mill's father, John Mill, was a friend and sort of a follower of Jeremy Bentham, right? And he raised John Stuart Mill according to sort of utilitarian principles. This is where John Stuart Mill gets it from his father, who got it from Bentham. But again, John Stuart Mill reforms Bentham's act utilitarianism into his own version, which is called rule utilitarianism. And what is rule utilitarianism? Rule utilitarianism is a moral theory which states that a moral rule is correct if and only if following that moral rule generally results in the greatest good for the greatest number, or he would say pleasure for the greatest number, but we can leave it at that. Now, an act is morally right if and only if it accords with a correct moral rule. So notice the last part of that sounds like a deontologist. If you think back to our introduction to ethical theory, I said deontologists are the ones that want to talk about rules. And John Stuart Mill is talking about rules. You can see that in the last half, right? An action is right if and only if it accords with a correct moral rule. But he also wants to say that what makes moral rules correct is whether or not generally following those rules results, has the consequence of the happiness, the general happiness, the greatest pleasure for the greatest number. So if you had to say, well, which should I file John Stuart Mill under? Should I file him under the category of consequentialist, or should I file him under the category of deontologist? I'll give you a moment. Hopefully, you said consequentialist. Why? Yeah, he's talking about rules, but what makes the rules good rules? In the end, consequences. In the end, it's the consequences that are doing the work, it's the engine that's pulling this train, okay? So in the end, it's the consequences that are most relevant, and they determine what the correct moral rules are. Now, he's deliberately trying to wed consequentialist thinking and deontological thinking. He's doing that deliberately. But at the end of the day, I think he's genuinely a consequentialist. According to this view, the right act for a person to do is the one which conforms to the right moral code of the community. And the right moral code for the community to adopt is the one which, when adhered to by all, will best promote the general good. Again, because of the practical limitations of pleasure assessment, coming up with those numbers, personal bias, efficiency, and the time constraints of moral decision-making and consequence predictions, etc., morality must be about general action guiding directives, what we might call policies or rules of thumb, rather than individual act assessments. So he's giving up on act utilitarianism in favor of rule utilitarianism, largely for practical reasons. Therefore, the moral question cannot, for practical reasons, be what action in this particular case will produce the greatest pleasure, but rather, generally, what actions produce the greatest pleasure. Rule utilitarianism was devised to cope with cases in which it appeared that applying the utilitarian standard directly to practical situations would lead us to contradict the traditional code of morality, which enjoys strong intuitive support. Mill believed that rule utilitarianism yielded results which were in conformity with Christian ethics and traditional ethics generally. So notice, what Mill is arguing here is he could give us justification for the claim murder is wrong, lying is wrong, truth-telling is right, cheating is wrong, stealing is wrong. And why can he make those claims? Because he's only making claims about generally speaking. Generally speaking, more harm is created in society by murder than by refraining from murder, generally speaking. Is that always the case? It's not a question of whether it's always the case. It's a question of whether it's generally the case. And if it's generally the case, then the correct moral code to adopt is the one which prohibits murder and cheating and stealing. So notice he can give a justification for those prohibited actions that we talked about when we were talking about theoretical problems with act utilitarianism. This version does address some of the objections raised by act utilitarianism. Again, for practical objection 1, trying to assess pleasure and pain and give it numerical value, as we move to the question of general good and happiness, the calculations can be more rough and estimated. So this is why if you're, say, a city planner, you can make more general calculations than which is the most efficient way of getting from point A to point B today. What you're looking at is, generally speaking, what works, right? Again, and then practical objection number 2, how could I know the long-term consequences of my actions, etc.? Again, since we are no longer concerned with predicting individual chains of causes and effects linked to individual actions, the business of evaluating the utility of a policy is more manageable and less speculative, right? This is why we can engage in these kinds of calculations in terms of marketing or economics, sociology, city engineering, etc., because we're looking at general trends rather than individual actions. To the theoretical objection, what about things like lying, stealing, murder, slavery, etc.? Mill has the means of justifying the claim that lying is wrong, cheating is wrong, murder is wrong, independent of knowing the individual consequences of the individual actions. In this way, he could reasonably claim that his theory conforms to our most basic moral intuitions rather than contradicts them. And then finally, rule utilitarianism provided Mill with a way of trying to justify rights, moral duties, and what's called the liberal society. Mill argues for the right to personal autonomy and against paternalism in a very famous essay of his called On Liberty. So the classical meaning of the word a liberal society is a society which allows you to pursue your own happiness unmolested by government, unregulated, right? And Mill argues for just such a society. Paternalism is the view that refers to those laws or other prohibitions imposed on persons which constitute a limit on an individual personal freedom for his or her own good. So when society or when the state or when someone else restricts your individual freedom for your own good, this is what's called a paternalistic act, coming from the Latin word pater for parent, right? Parentism. And when the state or society or some individual sort of acts as your parent. Now, there's nothing wrong with paternalism if you are the parent, right? It is your responsibility as a parent to limit a child's personal liberty and freedom for the child's own good. Okay, maybe the child wants to eat candy for dinner, but that doesn't mean you allow the child to eat candy for dinner. It's your responsibility as a parent to say, no, I'm going to not allow you to do what you would like to do. I'm going to compel you to do what is in your own best interest for your own good. Oh, well, I want to wear the princess dress. Yes, but it's, 32 degrees outside. It's freezing. You have to wear something warmer. Right? And I'm going to compel you to do that for your own good. So again, I don't think there's anything wrong with paternalism if you're the parent and you're talking about a child. Where it becomes more controversial is when you're not the parent and when it's not a child, when it's another adult. So to compel another adult to do what is in the adult's own best interest for the adult's own good and limit that adult's freedom, well, that becomes more controversial. Mill argues that it's a violation of that individual's rights, their right to autonomy and freedom. And now, it's one thing if what that individual is doing is harming someone else. Okay, then the state has need and a responsibility to step in. But if it's a self-regarding act, it doesn't affect anybody but the agent himself or herself, then the state does not have a need or even a right to step in and limit that individual's personal freedom. So says an anti-paternalist, such as John Stuart Mill. Now, why is it? Why is it that Mill argues in his essay on liberty that the state does not have that function? Well, he gives an He gives a rule utilitarian argument for that. And he says, generally speaking, governments micromanaging your lives are not as efficient a way of bringing about general happiness and societal flourishing as allowing people to pursue their own happiness individually and privately, unmolested by government. So he gives a rule utilitarian. It's better policy for government to stay out of your life than to try to micromanage it. We think of that slogan. It's often associated with Thomas Jefferson, but I don't know that it was actually said by Jefferson. I've never actually seen a quotation of Jefferson where he says this, but it's attributed often to Thomas Jefferson, where he says that government is best which governs least. Well, that's certainly in the spirit of a liberal society. That seems to be what Mill is arguing for in his essay on liberty. Mill argues that the government and society in general should stay out of an individual's private, self-regarding affairs. He acknowledges that we ought to encourage character development, but not through punitive regulation. Now note, though, that if this is the only thing which justifies the rights to of the individual, according to Mill, is utility, right? That seems to be the only justification he's offering for individual rights. Again, it's a consequentialist justification. That is, he's claiming, generally speaking, it is an empirical fact that society or government micromanaging the private affairs of individuals is a less efficient means to general happiness than letting people pursue happiness privately, unmolested by government. That seems to be his line of argument. Again, it's a consequentialist line. However, if this is the only justification of rights, then in principle, should government develop a more efficient method of making the general population happy by regulating the private lives of citizens, it would be justified in taking more intrusive action. Now, Mill would not have been a fan of this view, I don't think, right? He doesn't consider it, but I don't think he would have been a fan. But what argument could Mill offer against an intrusive government that efficiently produces the greatest pleasure for the greatest number? One thinks of Huxley's Brave New World, where the government is rather efficient at securing maximal pleasure and minimal pain. Why? Well, heavy use of pharmaceuticals, etc., but by very intrusive means, right? So Huxley, that was a dystopia. Huxley was not a fan. I don't think Mill would have been a fan, but it's not clear what arguments he would marshal from On Liberty against such a program. Again, Mill would probably have disapproved even under these circumstances. However, it is unclear what philosophical objections his system would present. Again, his rule utilitarian system. A godless morality. According to Mill, our knowledge of moral values and moral obligations is based on experience and the experience of ordinary people. So we've talked earlier in this course about British empiricism. Mill is part of that whole British empiricist tradition, which thinks nothing is in the mind that wasn't first in the senses, and all knowledge has to be grounded in experience. And his ethics is clearly grounded in experience, the ordinary experience of ordinary human beings. Mill was also sometimes referred to as a hyper-empiricist. He thought even math is grounded in experience, but that's another story for another day. So this appeal to human desires and preferences, rather than to reason, like the rationalist perhaps, right? Or the moral structure of the universe, or rather than appeal to nature, like Aristotelian teleology, or the will of God as an appeal to the divine command theory. This earned utilitarianism the reputation of being a godless doctrine. God doesn't seem to play any role in moral thinking from John Stuart Mill's perspective. It's based in ordinary human experience, etc. Mill departed. Oh, Mill's heresy. Ooh, heresy. But it's not a religious heresy. Mill departed from Bentham's doctrine that all pleasures were of equal quality by saying that some kinds of pleasure are intrinsically better than others. So I have a quote here that I neglected to tell you earlier, but when Jeremy Bentham, talked about act utilitarianism and his version of pleasure, etc., or hedonism, he was a quantitative hedonist who says that between any two pleasures, they could only differ in value if they differ in quantity, that there are no qualitative differences between pleasures. And the slogan that's associated with Bentham is his idea that pushpin was as good as poetry. Pushpin was a game like darts that they used to play in the pubs in England. And he says, well, some people like to play darts, some people like to read poetry, but when it comes to pleasure, pleasure is pleasure is pleasure, and pushpin is as good as poetry. You can't say of one set of pleasures, say the pleasure of playing darts, is inferior to the pleasure one gets from reading poetry, or vice versa for that matter. Unlike Bentham, John Stuart Mill was a qualitative hedonist. So Bentham, quantitative hedonist, Mill, qualitative hedonist. Again, the quantitative hedonist, Bentham, is one who holds that the only value difference between two pleasures is amount or quantity. The qualitative hedonist, John Stuart Mill and others, holds that two pleasures of equal quantity may differ with respect to value based on their respective qualities. So he thought that you might have pleasures that have differing values because of the quality of the pleasure, not merely the quantity. Mill's utilitarianism was sometimes accused of being a swinish doctrine since it only appeals to pleasure. But Mill countered that accusation by saying this would only be the case if you imagined that human beings were capable of nothing other than swinish pleasures. But humans can experience more than those, and these latter pleasures are superior. So we can experience the physical kinds of pleasures that swine enjoy, but we can also experience pleasures of the mind, intellectual pleasures, and these are of a superior quality. And this is why the pleasure of a human being can be qualitatively superior to the pleasure of swine, of pigs. Well, how can we know which pleasures are of superior to which? Experience, says Mill. Of course, he was an empiricist after all. Specifically, he says we should consult the feelings and preferences of people who've had wide experience in life. And he thinks that if you consult those with wide experiences of pleasure and have experienced the pleasures of playing darts and of reading poetry, of going to a tractor pull, or of listening to opera, what you'll find is that people with wide experiences in pleasure will almost unanimously tell you that the pleasures of the mind are superior in quality to the pleasures of the body, of the physical pleasures. Mill would urge us to acquiesce to the judgments of pleasure assessors to decide on the moral desirability of various pleasures. Ask those who are familiar with both which they prefer. Quoting from Mill, he says, if two pleasures, rather, of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or most all who have experienced of both give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that is the more desirable pleasure. So if people who've experienced pleasure in both give a decided preference to one over the other, we have reason to acquiesce to their judgments of these pleasure assessors, that they seem to know what they're talking about. Mill claims that experience demonstrates that mental pleasures are judged more satisfying than mere physical pleasures by those well acquainted with both. Thus, we have empirical reason to believe that mental pleasures are indeed of superior quality, for human beings at least, than physical pleasures. Thus, Mill can say, even as a hedonist, it is better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Further, Mill says, it is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And why is this? Because in both cases, the dissatisfied party is nevertheless enjoying a better quality of pleasure and thus a better quality of life than the intellectual inferior. So the human being is able to enjoy a greater degrees of pleasure, even if not quantitatively greater, but qualitatively greater than a pig. So it's better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, because even a dissatisfied human is capable of greater qualities of pleasure than the pig. In the same way, it's better to be a wise Socrates who is dissatisfied than a fool who's satisfied but is intellectually inferior. Why? Because Socrates can enjoy greater intellectual pleasures than the fool. And so, despite being dissatisfied, is nevertheless enjoying a greater quality of life. Note, however, that Mill is perhaps stacking the deck here, since the only persons qualified to judge on his terms are those who have developed pleasures or tastes. But we could call them developed, or we could equally well call them distorted. I don't have a particularly refined palate when it comes to wine. I can't tell a good wine from a bad wine, to be perfectly honest. I'm perfectly happy with Carlo Rossi. Okay? My one brother, who does have a developed palate for wine, doesn't even serve me good wine anymore because his thought is, what's the point? You don't even know the difference. And I don't. He's quite right. But does he have a better experience of wine than I do? Or does he have a simply distorted view of wine than me? And why should I distort my pleasure that I take in wine to conform to his, right? Mine is far less expensive, right? But this is why, for instance, Mill is accused sometimes of being an elitist that sanctifies the preferences of upper middle class, middle-aged European white men, because those are the only ones who end up being the pleasure assessors on his view. All right, so I think that about concludes my, oh no, it doesn't. Further, this smacks of Aristotelian virtue. And what do I mean by that? Well, he seems to be saying that the happy life more approaches Aristotle's notion of eudaimonia versus momentary satisfaction. I'm unconvinced that Mill can defend this view on purely hedonistic grounds. Finally, note the very notion that there is a qualitative difference between two pleasures is termed Mill's heresy, because to claim that two pleasures of equal quantity may nevertheless differ in value seems to be presupposing a standard of evaluation, a good-making quality, other than pleasure. Well, this seems to contradict hedonism then. You've left the reservation, John Stuart Mill. If you think that there's a standard of evaluation other than pleasure, you're no longer speaking hedonism, right? That's why it's called a heresy. Now, he didn't think so, and there's other qualitative hedonists who deny that it is heretical, that it's a contradiction, but it's accused of that. And if I'm going to show you my cards, I kind of think that's correct, right? All right, so that concludes my remarks on social hedonism, and I thank you for your attention. Hopefully you found this helpful, and until next time.